What I want to do very quickly is connect us with our past, and particularly with the past of Antioch University, and how Antioch University has participated in the empowering of working people over the last 100 years, 150 years. So, once upon a time, well, first let me say that there are major changes in higher education coming about, and they very closely resemble what was occurring 100 and 125 years ago in industry in America. So the issues are very, very similar, and I'll try to quickly point out what some of those moves are. Following the Civil War, in the industrialization period, more and more immigrants and people from rural people moved into the cities and began working in factories. That was the great industrialization. Well, you know what it was like? It was horrible. It was horrible in those years. People were poorly paid. They lived in tenements. There were no health care, no benefits, nothing. And every time a market for a product went down for a month or 6 months, they were all laid off. And then when it started up again, the bosses would hire them back in. So everybody was what we now call a contingent worker. That is, they worked when there was work, and they did not work whenever there wasn't work. So nobody had a steady income, and everybody was poor. So this, and at the same time, remember that the great fortunes that we all go to the library at Carnegie and Rockefeller and so forth were being built on this time. So we had this huge difference between the very rich and the working people who were very poor. In those days, it was industrialists primarily. Today, it is primarily the financial community and the bankers who are very rich, and the rest of us have been left behind. As the 19th century drew to a close, more and more American working people began to organize to defend their rights and to establish their rights. The first American labor unions were formed and continued to grow through the middle of the 20th century. The greatest period of growth in labor organizing, working people's organizing, was during, of course, the Great Depression of the 1930s. And that organizing was not a Tea Party. Some of you may know or have heard stories that it was a very bloody process, filled with violence. Many, many workers and their families were killed in this process. For example, probably one of the major issues, major turning points, major events was the Ludlow Massacre in Ludlow, Idaho. Colorado. Southern Colorado was a big coal mining area at that time. And conditions were, of course, horrible. And so the workers went on strike, and the coal companies, the biggest one being a Rockefeller coal company, hired Pinkerton guards and brought in the National Guard. That day, 24 people, most of them women and children, died. They burned the camp, the strikers' camp down, and a whole bunch of women and children suffocated in a hotel, in a tent. That summer, in those coal strikes in Colorado, 199 workers and their families died. This is fairly typical. Those of you who know the history of Appalachia and other regions, that this was a fairly typical process. Thank goodness we're not at that point yet. But what happened after this great organizing growth during the 1930s was that the financial and manufacturing elites decided that unions had become too powerful. All of the, as BJ was saying, all of the benefits that we enjoy today were put into effect because of pressure from working people through their unions. The 8-hour day, the weekend, the 5-day work week, workers' compensation, Social Security, all of that stuff came about during this time period when most working people in industry were members of unions. So what happened? Some of you may have heard, how many have heard of McCarthy period? Yeah. What happened was that following World War II, unions were strong, the economy was growing, productivity was shared, incomes were rising, and this was too much for the leadership of industry and finance, and so they gave support to the search for communists in every walk of life. And so we went through about a 12-year period. Joseph McCarthy, the senator, was sort of the icon of this. But what happened was that much of the attack was on organizers of labor unions and the people who had been effective in creating the social programs and the economic benefits that your parents were, or grandparents were enjoying during the 1950s. What happened during that time is relevant to what we're going to do next week. One of the techniques that was used during a strike was to hire what were called, and still are, called scabs, S-C-A-B, who would come in and replace the workers, and the workers would be locked out of the factory. So the workers invented something called the sit-in, which was they occupied the factories 24/7. And in this way, they prevented scabs from coming in. They prevented the equipment from being used by other workers, and they also implicitly threatened to destroy that equipment because they were in the factory at all times. Very effective. What they did was they just took over the assets. And so we talk about a sit-out here as being the analog to this very effective strategy invented by workers, organized workers in the 1930s. So the peak of the anti-union efforts following World War II was 1980, when some of you may have heard the professional air traffic controllers went on strike because they were badly overworked and it was dangerous. I know that because I was on the picket lines with them and I listened to their stories of what it was like to control airplanes at that time, and it made you not want to fly. At about this same time, Antioch was growing from a progressive college in Yellow Springs, Ohio, to a national university. In 1974, the national labor organizations realized they needed a leadership education program and created the George Meany Center for Labor Studies just outside of Washington, D.C. And guess what? The Bachelor of Arts degree in Labor Studies was launched through a partnership with Antioch. And Antioch granted Bachelor of Arts in Labor Studies for 23 years until 1997, when the Labor College received its own accreditation from the state of Maryland and the Mid-Atlantic accreditation body. This movement back from organizing and recognizing the contributions of ordinary people has mushroomed over the last 40 years. Some of you know it as neoliberalism. This ideology that everything should be privately owned has really changed higher education. I went through all the way through to Ph.D. before this period, and it is very, very painful to watch what has happened to you. What's happened is that everything has been, it's been decided that everything, you're on your own, and you don't get anything from the community. And as a result, the cost of education has ballooned, and because it's a system of oppression, the top leadership has expanded while money has not flowed to the staff and faculty in institutions across the country. So for example, this morning, the new, who's apparently very nice, president of the UW, was just awarded a $910,000 a year salary. I don't know what you do with $910,000. Anyway, it makes her the third highest paying president in the country of a public institution in a state that is 45th or 48th in state allocations to education. So many have called this the corporatization of higher education. It's privatizing the costs of it. It's centralizing decision making. It's removing the control of the educational experience from students, staff, and faculty, and lodging them in senior administrators who often have little or no experience in the classroom and no pedagogical understanding of what is necessary. Just as in the 19th century, 75% of higher education faculty in the United States today are contingent. That is, they are adjuncts or on annual appointments. This is right back where if you're needed, we'll call you just before the class starts. If you're not needed, we don't care what happens to you. And a high proportion, less at this campus than the other Antioch campuses, a high proportion of faculty are in that situation today. So that brings us to Antioch Seattle today. And as you know, we're moving to a new building in order to save costs and allocate those costs to things that administrators feel is more important. They have rented a building, space in a building, that is equivalent to about 60% of the space in this building. And my understanding is that this building has usable space of 57,000 square feet in it. And the new building will have usable space of 31,000 square feet. As a result, the number of classrooms is severely reduced. Staff and particularly faculty offices have been almost totally eliminated. There will be no place to meet your advisor or your instructor unless you reserve one of a half a dozen rooms that will be available on a rotating reservable basis. This is because there is room in the building, but senior administration has decided that they don't want to pay for all of that room. So we are in a 3-story building. We're in the upper 2 stories of that new 3-story building, but we don't get 2 stories of it. We get 1.5 stories of it. And we, on the faculty's union bargaining team, have been trying for 6 months to get the data from the administration to figure out and help them figure out whether or not and how we could afford the rest of that room. We have been refused that data to date. So this is why we need your support on the sit out next week. And others will explain that more about how that's going to work. But we need participation in this because otherwise you're going to be meeting your faculty member out in the hallway. Okay? Enough.